Hello there, and welcome back to our Orlando time-lapse series. In today's episode and also in the next episode, we will primarily build on the fire station. So before I start talking about the fire station and what its purpose is in the park itself, I wanted to quickly note at the beginning here that I will later talk also about the newest update of Planet Coaster 2. But first, let's talk about the fire station. And already I have some question marks here, since I'm not completely sure if it's now called a fire station, a fire department, a firehouse. Sometimes it's even called the Town Square Fire Station. So for here in our time-lapse series, I will just refer to it as a fire station. For me at least, it doesn't really make a difference. But I can imagine that in reality there might be a difference between a firehouse and a full-sized fire department. So it maybe describes the complexity and sheer size of such a building type. So something that I noticed when you look from above and see those three buildings that we built so far, so the Chamber of Commerce on the left side, the City Hall in the middle, and on the right side now the fire station, that they perform an ensemble, so to say it with other words, a building group or structure that consists out of multiple buildings, but they are set in such a formation that they share the same vanishing points and axes. So you can say they perform like a string or a row. And only those two bridge elements that connect those buildings together are set back. And so, again, there is a dramaturgy that happens when you set those buildings in this formation. In the middle one, you have here the biggest building, and therefore you give it a certain emphasis. You set them in a certain relationship to each other. And you see that also that both buildings on the left and the right, they only have 2 levels. On the City Hall you have 3 levels, so you have this extra roof on the top. So by now you kinda get the impression that whoever designed this ensemble on this group of buildings, that they were very intentional in doing so and compose this architectural scene that you see. And that's the thing I think you can take away with here, and that's helpful and useful, especially when you're trying to create a park on your own, that you think about those scenes that you want your guests to experience in the end, like shots out of a movie. In this concept that you have scenes here in the park, you can take that to Big Thunder Mountain, to Cinderella's Castle, or to Space Mountain, all those things. View them as paintings or as still frames. And therefore, by their composition and their architecture and their color, or like here where you make an emphasis on the importance of certain elements to each other. And all those things have at the end a certain feeling or impact on your guests that stroll by those areas. But let's get back to the fire station. So since we are still in the layouting phase, I just placed down some rough walls where I want later the fire station to be set, and I used my rulers of course to measure out the perfect spot for that. And here you see me before I start on the fire station adding some more details to this bridge element that connects the City Hall and the fire station. And by the way, those 2 areas on the left and right side of the City Hall are quite interesting. On the left side you only have one colonnade, so one area which is surrounded by those columns that hold this bridge element, and in the middle of those buildings and the bridge element you have a courtyard there. And on the right side now on the City Hall you have actually 4 colonnades, so it's only surrounded by those areas where you have those columns. But the courtyard on this side, you can't walk on that. There is foliage only on that. And this, I think, is a great example where you have a repetitive element, like those courtyards, that look from the front pretty identical, I would say, but you make them so much more interesting when you multiply the amount of those colonnades, for example, or if you limit the courtyard that is in the center by foliage. And so you can make variations out of that. And those elements get much more interesting to look at also. So here I just quickly work on the floor. And I believe I mentioned in a previous episode that I decided to go for those panel elements that work just great as those precasted concrete tiles. And since they are all individual pieces, we can later go in and recolor them a slight bit. And this will boost the realism heavily, I think. And here I just adjust them a little bit. So especially on those corners where the street goes into a curve, I have to rotate them on 2 axes so that they look like that they are cut off on their diagonal. I think this is a great tip if you have to do some road work or when you work with multiple layers and want to create like a star or some geometry where we have very sharp corners, for example. And when you lay them on the ground, you have the ability there that you can hide something under the ground, and therefore if you rotate it slightly, you can work with that cutoff effect. And for example, I used that method when creating the star that you see in the ground in front of the Cinderella's castle in Anaheim. But however, as you see, we started now on the fire station itself, and the first thing was to get those columns in the right proportion. That's my favorite word in this whole timeless series, proportion and scale. It's always the thing I come back to, and always when we start something new like here the fire station, the first thing that we have to establish is some sense of size and scale and ultimately the right proportion on those things. And I kid you not, on this column it took me quite a while to get it into the right proportion and also to figure out how to do details on them, because we work in such a small scale relative to the scaling of the game, and at some point it really gets a struggle and a fight for those details, because almost all elements in the game are just too big that they would give a nice detail here. And so the only elements that are left are those wooden elements, then the aquatic metal pieces and the coaster support structure elements. And when I look on all the buildings I built so far, always when it comes to details, I come to those pieces. The wooden pieces, the metal pieces, or the coaster support pieces. And actually I quite like that, because I already have them in my mind. I don't have to search now endlessly for a new piece that I don't know that I could use here. I mean, those instances also happen where something pretty randomly fits perfectly on something. But in the majority of cases, I just come back to those 3 groups, which I stored in my brain, so to say, and I just call them up, and there they are. This, of course, boosts the efficiency extremely, because the biggest bottleneck is the amount of time that I spend scrolling through the menu to find the right piece. I mean, this is a huge waste of time that I don't want to spend, of course, and there it becomes very reasonable then to stick to those favorite pieces that I use throughout the build very often, but of course in different scales, in different colors, in different arrangements. I mean, here in the footage you will see that not very often, because I always try to cut that out of the video. I mean, there are also many times where I just stop building completely and do something else. And so that's of course something I don't want you to see, because I don't want to waste your time as a viewer of this channel. I try to respect your time as you're watching by only showing you valuable things in the end. Of course with the claim that you will see everything, but but you shouldn't see everything that is unnecessary to see. And I say that because sometimes I have the impression that when I, for example, watch one of my favorite Twitch streamers, those streams are very long and exhausting, I would also say, to watch over a longer period. And so sometimes I try to watch that, but in multiple sections. And I know that most of us work in real life, and you have a family and you have friends and where you have to care about, and you can't, of course, watch for hours on end those videos. And that's also why I try to minimize that time that you have to see in order to see everything, but in an effective way. I think this is constantly overlooked in today's, let's say, content creation sometimes, that you just see so many things that could be reduced down in order to respect the viewer's watch time. And sometimes, and I think this happens even more often, that you have content out there that is so drastically cut and only for the views, for the clickbait, so to say, that you barely see anything informative and qualitative. And where it comes down to in the end is, I think, the term pace. I mean, you can describe with that pretty much everything that you see within a video game or a movie, for example. Maybe you have a more fast-paced action movie, and where many things happen, and where you have barely breathing time in between. And in other instances, you have the exact opposite of that. And so it's at the end a very subjective thing. But still, I think there is a sweet spot in between those two extremes of being too long or too short. And at least here in the time-lapse series, I think this is the right way, that you see everything, but as I said, in an effective way, that I don't waste your time in the end. So let's come back to the build. So as you're watching, I built this trim in front of the fire station, and this trim surrounds and holds the balcony on this building. And my impression was, when I saw the fire station, you have there very interesting trim shapes and those ornaments. And I think they are vital for this appearance in the end. And the other thing that is, of course, very prominently set there is the brickwork. And at least for now, I don't want to spoil you, but maybe you can guess it already, that I have another solution for the brickwork. But at least to make this trim work, I used many aquatic metal pieces here. And it might seem very ridiculously, because you have so many of them and multiple layers on layers to make that trim more prominent. But I think it's justified just because it's so visually appealing when you look on this fire station. It's the first thing I think that catches your eye, except maybe from the fire tower on the right. And in the process of building that, I was still thinking and fighting in my mind between those 2 points, to be piece effective, but on the other side to recreate it very accurately. And in this case, I think it's just a consequence of this design. Because this roof shape that you see in front there, I don't see any other piece in the game where you could properly make that. And it's just the consequence of using this piece, and I have to use this piece also on those linear sections. I mean, on some parts I used an art piece instead, just to reduce down the piece count where I could, but in general it's just, as I said. And the hope that I just have, that we have in the future more content updates, and I just hope that there are some pieces that will be added in the future that make our lives so much more easy, and where you could maybe do something like that a lot more efficiently in the end. And maybe I think this is quite a good transition here, that we talk now about the newest update in the game. And maybe if you are watching also other content creators about Planko, you probably already know a lot about this update and what new features there are. And the bug fix list was like, I think 10 pages or something like that. And it's just huge, this update, in terms of quality of life improvements. And I think this game needed that. It needed a fix that consistently improves the game on all departments. So not only on water-related rides, also on coasters and just the overall playability of this game. And so I'm obviously so relieved that they finally, after quite a long time, that they released an update that is well received by the community and where you can feel that they invested real effort into that. I mean, even to write all those bug fixes down, I think, is a little achievement. And to be quite honest, I didn't look now into every specific bug fix. I just looked at the main features that we are getting in this update. And the most important one, I feel, is just that they added now video billboards, where you can not only show videos, but also images. And this is for us such a big deal, to load in those reference images. And in the couple of the next weeks, I will work on that to provide a reference image where you have this image of the park in a very high resolution. And I already looked in the game how big those billboards are. I mean, this is vital for this whole thing to work. I mean, I wrote on my Discord a whole instruction how to bring those reference image into the game and to get them into the right scale. I mean, this is pretty complicated. And so the biggest video billboard that we have in the game is the 32-meter one. And you can scale that billboard also 3 times. That means you have then 96 meters on the longer side and I believe 48 or something like that on the shorter side. And that's the plan here, that when I load those billboards in, that I lower the amount of images that I need later on, and therefore I use the biggest billboard that we have in the game. And I do this mainly because I don't want to have now like 1,000 billboards in the game, and later you have to go through them all manually and select the images that you want there. But it's not only that. I don't know how the performance is in the end of those billboards, and therefore it's pretty reasonable, I think, to lower the amount of images that we need in the end. I mean, there are a lot of unanswered questions still. And another one would be that I don't know how those billboards behave if you scale them now. If you scale them up, is the image that you have on this billboard also scaled with it? And my guess is that it is. And if that happens, of course, I lose the resolution now on those images. I mean, you have to make sure that those images by themselves have enough resolution that they will look good in the end to be usable. But that means, of course, if I have now such a big area in the park that is 96 meters by 48, for example, then I have to increase the resolution, or basically the file size of the image itself. So I think at the end it's just a try and error and see what works best here, but always with the goal in mind to save the performance and to pick the option which is most effective in the end. Well, saying that, I mean, I have to laugh a bit because I know what's still to come in this episode, in this footage. Let's just say it's maybe not the most performance improving method to create something, but maybe you can understand it a little bit just from the perspective of recreating something very accurately. And I think you can't recreate that with other things right now in the game. And so I have to go this path of suffering then, of increasing those piece counts quite tremendously. But it's always the same debate, I think. And maybe I'm a little bit repetitive on this thing. But just imagine if I would now spare out those details in the end. I think you don't get the same quality when you look on those things. And so I always have this inner approach on myself to recreate something to the best of my ability. And if there isn't any other way to recreate that with better pieces and more efficiently, then I have to go down this road. And at the end, I think it's reasonable to say that and to do that. because we have a vision in mind to recreate this theme park. And if I would leave out all those little details in the prequel in Anaheim, then this park wouldn't look nearly as great as it looks now. I don't want to sound arrogant here, but it's just the thing. If I wouldn't go for 470,000 pieces in the end and only maybe 200,000, it wouldn't even look close to the same thing. And that's the thing. You lose the accuracy to the real thing if you stick to a very low piece count. And I think if you see it from that perspective in the end, you have this valid reason why you do it like that. So at this point, you maybe know what I'm talking about. It's the brickwork. And I think this texture is quite okay, I think, on those preset wall sets. But when you look on this building, you will see very prominently that those bricks are in different colors and that you have different arrangements of those bricks in the end. On the corner, for example, you have much darker bricks, and on the wall itself you have there an alternating pattern of those brick tones. And this makes the building much more interesting, I think, and it would lower so much of that uniqueness at the end if you would spare that out. And therefore, I have to recreate that, to keep this magic alive. So something I have to note here, that the building that you see in the park itself, let's say there was an update of it in 2019, I think. Not too sure about the exact year. But before that, the brickwork didn't have this coloring on it. And in fact, it looks similar to this brickwork wall set that we have in the game. So as you're seeing me creating this, I was thinking about which pieces to use for this brickwork, which piece would fit best in the scale and the proportion of this building. And so this was the first piece that I found, just those wooden panels. And I wasn't really satisfied with that. And in the end I did 3 approaches to find the best piece for those bricks. And normally I would cut this out of the footage just to spare the watch time, as I said earlier. But I think it's valuable to see that, to see this struggle on finding the perfect piece for that and even repeating this process and to nail it down. So the piece that you are seeing right now, I used that for the second attempt and also the third attempt. On the third attempt it was just scaled down even more. And the thing was, when I used this piece, and you see it later when you put many on top of each other and where you see this typical brick pattern happening, that you will see a slight reflection on those bricks. And that's just the thing, because this object that we are using is actually, well, in the game metal, where you have like a reflection happening. And I looked into the settings and I found the screen space reflection toggle and I just turned it off. So basically what this graphics settings does is that you see like a reflection happening on the item itself, and where you see like when you have something very reflective, you would see the environment around it. And so I think this setting is really not that important in the end, I would say. In the prequel, I always turn that off, because when you do dark rides, you wouldn't get a true dark ride with this setting turned on, and the dark ride would actually be much darker if you would turn that off. So in the end, this setting is very minor in its effect, and you really only see that if you now have super reflective things in the park and where you have the intention that people will see that. I don't have that intention here. I just think it would be silly if we don't use this piece just because some graphics setting is randomly counteracting that. And at some point when I upload this park to the workshop, I would of course write a very detailed description how to load it properly. And this would be one of the first things to make sure that you have this setting turned off. Just a little side note to that. I would love if the game tells you when you are in the graphics settings menu that you would see a preview of each setting, what it actually does. I mean, I miss that in many games today, but especially here in a simulation game, where it's mostly about the visuals in a game, I just feel that there's a need for that. And it brings me also to another topic I wanted to talk about, that I believe there is a common misconception how you rate those graphic presets in a game. When you see there are 4 graphic settings, low, medium, high and ultra, you would always assume that ultra provides the best fidelity in your game. And this might be true in some games, but I believe within simulation games there's a disconnect of that, because you have so many settings that not only improve maybe the visual quality of textures, of water, of the sky or the foliage, you also have settings within those presets, like this screen space reflection, or like a bloom setting, or depth of field, or even motion blur. So in those instances, unless you know what you are doing and you know what those settings are doing in the end, you are dependent on the developer to figure out the perfect settings for whatever preset you take. And this just underlines what I said before, that it would be reasonable that you would just have something there that tells you exactly what those settings are doing. So earlier in this video, I was carried away a little bit by those billboards, and I would like to say some more words about the update. Aside from the billboards, we also have now custom speakers in the park, which is of course great for custom music and custom sound effects. And then we have ride synchronization, which is also great, I think. For us here in the time-lapse series on Orlando, I don't think that we will use that in the near future. It's another one of those missing features, and it's pretty cool that we have it now. Another thing are that there are interchangeable coaster cars, which is also pretty huge, I think. In the prequel we had that also. Back then it was even more useful because you couldn't add custom scenery to rides, and there the only option was to use those interchangeable cars. And so it's also great that we get that back. And along with those features, they also implemented just overall improvements of the game in general, such as enhanced guest navigation, so that your guests will much more realistically stroll to your park, and that they no longer only stick to one single route, and that you have much less congestion happening in the park. More so, you have a bunch of smaller improvements and fixes, and as I said, the bug fix list is just so huge. But for me, the biggest improvement that they reworked the multi-select tool. And so it actually works now like in the prequel. You just left click and drag, and with Control or Alt you can add things or subtract things from your selection. It's perfect, it's exactly like in the prequel, and on top of that we have still the ability to press also the multi-select shortcut, and within that you have the added option that you can actually filter out specific things, such as rides, shops or paths. So if you don't want them in your selection later on, you can just disable them then. So overall, I think this is the biggest improvement in the game in this update, aside from those billboards, of course. So I think I mentioned all the important new features and improvements that are worth to mention, but it doesn't end here. The next update, the third update, is planned for March, and within that we have mostly water ride features and a lot of other different improvements, I'm sure. And beyond that, they announced that they will also release an update in April and in May. But I think we will get much more information about those updates in the planned livestream of Frontier on the 26th of February. And so the big hope that I have for the game is, as they said, that they bring back those themes from the prequel, I think now, where we received this update that fixed a lot in the game, that maybe in 2 or 3 months from now, that we will receive something that would add more content to the game, and especially on the building side. So I think at this point I talked about half an hour, and so for the rest of the episode I think we will just overlay some music, and I think it makes it much more pleasant also to watch, and where you not constantly have to focus on what I'm saying. And after that I will conclude today's episode as usual. So as usual, I would like to conclude today's episode. In today's episode we mainly talked about the newest update in Planet Coaster 2. Meanwhile we built the first part of this fire station, and in the next episode we will finish this. I hope you enjoyed it today. If you did, subscribe, like or comment, join our Discord server, watch my videos about Anaheim or Orlando, and thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.